One species has just 6 chromosomes. That's the smallest number of chromosomes among all mammals. But another species has 8 chromosomes. And some individuals in that same species have 9 chromosomes. There's another species that has 46 chromosomes, yet another that has 66, and another that has 70 chromosomes. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the crazy chromosome variation among deer. I'm talking about the broader group of deer, or the family Cervidae. Includes about 19 different genera, 55 different species, and the number of chromosome variants among those 55 species is just remarkable. And I'm going to show you some of the molecular genetic evidence of that today. Why am I doing this? Well, if you follow my channel, you'll know that I made the fairly provocative claim just a week ago that Ken Ham is a young Earth evolutionist. Ken Ham has been calling a lot of other creationists evolutionists, or under the influence of evolutionary theory. Here I called Ken Ham a young Earth evolutionist. And in doing so, I was talking about the canine family, right? The wolf and fox family. But here I want to focus on the deer. And I'm going to make the same point, but it's going to be a little more dramatic than I had. This is a more dramatic example than I had to work with the canines. So, without further ado, let's look at the crazy chromosomes in the deer family and ask ourselves, how could all these different chromosome conformations have evolved in just 4,000 years? We got that coming up. Where to begin with this? Of course, I already covered some of this material when I talked about canines and Ken Ham and creationism. But I feel like I need to do a brief reminder, since not everyone's going to watch all these videos, right? So Ken Ham, let's call him the best known representative of a worldview called young Earth creationism. That all the diversity of life on Earth can be traced back to thousands of different separate lineages of things that God created at the beginning being about 6,000 years ago, maybe 10,000 years ago. So God created individual separate kinds of organisms, and then those kinds of organisms have adapted and radiated into the variety of things we see today. In an evolutionary textbook, that is evolution, all right? That describes components of evolution. But for Ken Ham, that's not. Ken Ham says God created something like the dog kind. And then there was just 2 representatives of the dogs on Noah's Ark. Those 2 dogs stepped off, and they then diversified into all the different fox species we have and all the different wolf-like species we have. Some 35 different living species today, combined with maybe 50 to 100 other extinct species that have occurred over the last 4,000 years. That's a tremendous amount of change. And so the challenge for young Earth creationists is to explain how all the incredible diversity of all those different species today could have been contained in just 2 individuals on Noah's Ark. And that's the thing we're kind of driving at with looking at chromosomes. And that's what I talked about when I talked about the canine kind. Right? And so I also want to remind you of something else that Ken Ham and his organization, Answers in Genesis, has used as an argument. All right, so going back to the dog kind at the Creation Museum, this is a direct quote from the wall at from a display at the Creation Museum. Where did all this variation in the dog kind come from, or the canine family come from? Well, it's been determined genetically that all dogs, wolves, coyotes, foxes, jackals, dingoes, domesticated dogs, are related to one another. How do we know? How do creationists know? How does Ken Ham know that all the dogs came from just one pair of dogs that are on Noah's Ark? Because it's been determined genetically that all dogs are related to one another. There's something about their DNA that you look at it and it suggests that they're related to one another. Just like you look at any 2 of us and our DNA is fairly similar to each other, and you say, like, we probably share a common ancestor. Even if I can't trace my ancestry back to a parent that you and I share, I don't think that any of you out there listening to me doubt that at some point in the past, you and I share a common family member, right? We share a parent, even if I can't see it. And one of the evidences is in our genomes, in our DNA. And so Ken Ham is saying, look, you can look at all these dogs, you can see, hey, they all have similar DNA, similar genes and so forth, and therefore That's the evidence that they share a common ancestry. All right, and I made the point that, okay, great, Ken Ham, you're saying that genetically they're similar. But of course, you could say genetically cats and dogs are also similar to each other, but he's going to say, no, that's too different. They're too different from each other because I look at cats and dogs and they look different. I would say, look at their DNA, not all that different from one another. So how do you find the cutoff point between what is genetically different and what is genetically similar enough for you to call something one kind or a separately created kind versus these are just variations within a kind? And so Ken Ham wants to say that all canines are one kind because they're genetically similar. Now, he doesn't really define what genetically similar means. Right? It's very difficult to find in the creationist literature exactly what is being referred to with respect to the canines. But my point was, in my talk on canines, was I showed, look at all these different chromosome numbers, right? These different canines have experienced a variety of different fusions and fissions, breaking chromosomes apart and putting chromosomes together. And this actually does change the number of copies of genes. It removes some genes. So genetically, from a genome perspective, from the architecture of the genome itself, there's been an incredible amount of transformation of the genome in different species, such that these species the genes don't exactly line up with each other. So it's not just about the sequence differences, the A, T, C's, and G's. It's about the order of the genes, the structure of the chromosomes. And I said, this is a huge amount of variation. And if you're going to say that the ancestral dog, right? Well, actually, the ancestral dog is right here. Oh, no, right here. If you're going to say the ancestral dog, this is the ancestral condition of the dogs that walked off Noah's Ark, because there were only 2 dogs on Noah's Ark. They only preserved a pair of them. And then they had to become all these different chromosome numbers. Where did all that variation go? How did this happen? What's the molecular mechanism for changing these chromosome numbers and shape-shifting the genome to the point where you have these different genome structures in different species? This is not explained in the young Earth creationist literature because Ken Ham and others, when they talk about there's lots of variation in the original created kind and it just gets sorted into different species, that's their hand-wavy, simple explanation for how one pair of organisms, one pair of individuals, right, could have become lots and lots and lots of different sorts of, packages of different genetics. I said chromosomes, they don't make any sense. Just doesn't make any sense in this way. Well, now we come to the deer. Oh dear, Ken Ham has a much bigger problem when he looks at the deer because he and his organization and most other creationists that I've seen consider all of the deer to be one kind. God created a deer kind. And then at the time of Noah preserved 2 deer. And therefore, all this variation in deer, including you've got reindeer, you have moose, and then you have much smaller deer. We're going to be talking about barking deer. And so there's 55 different species of living deer in the cervid family, which scientists have separated into 19 different genera, identifying that there's quite a bit of difference between. Canines only really have 4 or 5 different genera. And so there's a tremendous amount of morphological, physical differences between these. And as we're going to see, there's a whole lot of genetic difference. But Answers in Genesis, at their Creation Museum, at the Ark Encounter, they've written an article called The Mammalian Kinds, all right, or Ark Kinds, what species were on the Ark or what kinds were on the Ark. And here, I just want to show you that they say that there was a cervid deer kind. Right? God made a deer kind. And today there's 19 genera and 51 species of deer. And at the end here, I said, this seems like strong evidence that all members of this family are related. And they're suggesting they're related because of some ability of some of them, certainly not all of them, to interbreed with one another. And then I think they would also point to, there's genetic similarities between them. And they also point to the fact that, the males all have antlers, right? And there's certain features that they all share. And that's why scientists put those together. Taxonomists put all the different deer-like organisms together into one group because they recognize they do have similarities to one another. Of course, the deer kind also have similarities to pronghorn, right? And certain kind of antelope. And then if you want to get into it, they also have a lot of similarities to cows and other hooved creatures, right? So where do you break this? Where does the line drawn between what a kind is and what a kind isn't? That's a question for another day. And of course, creationists don't really have answers to those questions. They have ideas. They don't necessarily have answers. We're here to talk about the difficulty of, let's say you do have a kind. Let's accept that proposition, that there was a deer kind. There was 2 deer on the ark. Then they became all this amazing variation. How did that come about? All right, 2 papers. Let's look at 2 papers. First one from BMC Genomics, and you notice it's from 2023. Staying current here. Chromosome level assembly of the Rangifer tarandus genome. That is the, what's that thing called? The reindeer. All right, and validation of cervid and bovid evolution insights. And I just want to show you a figure to give you a sense for the amount of mixing and changing of genomes, all right, of movement in the chromosomes. So what you're looking at here is a chromosome map, basically a comparison, all right, side-by-side comparison of the chromosomes of, on this side, you've got, this is cow, and this is reindeer. Now, Answers in Genesis and other creationists put cows in a different kind and reindeers in a different kind, right? You got the cervid kind and you got the bovid kind. So these are separately created. And you might first look at it and go like, well, this would be a good figure that creationists could use to show the differences between these 2 different kinds. There's a lot of genomic difference. What do I mean by that? Where you see these lines, you see this right here. This is chromosome number 9 in a cow. And they're saying the genes, basically this is called synteny analysis. Synteny is the order of the genes. So you have this gene next to this one one's next to this one, and so forth. You sort of have sets of genes that kind of go together. The genes that are on chromosome number 9 in a cow, if you trace them, what you find out is those same genes are on chromosome number, what's called chromosome number 2 in the reindeer. But they're not on a separate chromosome. There's other genes on chromosome number 2. Well, where do they come from? Or what are they similar to? I should say it that way. Well, chromosome number 26. Chromosome number 26 has a whole bunch of genes that fill out the rest of chromosome number 4. So what does chromosome 4 look like in a reindeer? It looks like the combination of chromosome number 9 and chromosome number 26 from a cow. In reality, the number of the actual genes that are on those chromosomes are quite similar to one another. In fact, I believe the order of those genes is probably quite similar. I'm sure there are some differences. But nonetheless, the overall structure of that chromosome simply looks like 2 chromosomes that are put together, right? They've fused with one another. So one way of looking at this is that there could be a common ancestor between a cow and a reindeer, and that common ancestor had either the cow or the reindeer version, right, of these chromosomes. And then when populations separated and they began to diverge into these 2 different kinds of organisms, one of them either divided their chromosome into 2 parts, or the 2 chromosomes in the original ancestor fused together to form a single chromosome in another one. And this isn't the only case. Here, chromosome 5 is a combination of 2 chromosomes. Chromosome number 1 is the fusion of 2 different chromosomes as well. Chromosome number 5 is also the combination of 2 other chromosomes from a cow. Right, so the genomes between these 2 different organisms are not radically different in the sense of the actual numbers of genes. So the amount of genetic information used to make these different organisms is quite similar, but they have organized it differently on the chromosomes. So I think a creationist could look at this and they would say, look, you got separate, you have common design where you have similar genes between these organisms, but they've been put in different places. Right? And so you started with them on different chromosomes, like the creator just made them that way. Great. Let's say you wanted to say that. Let's say you wanted to argue that. Now, let's look at another paper. Keep that in mind. Molecular mechanisms and topological consequences of drastic chromosomal rearrangements in Muntjac deer. barking deer. It's a small version of a deer that's from Southeast Asia. All right, bunch of authors here looking at whole chromosomes, right, or whole genome sequences, and reconstructing the chromosomes of several different deer, and analyzing then how these deer have changed over time. What's the evolution of the chromosomes, essentially? And this is from Nature Communications. I think this is 2021, maybe. All right, just 3 figures, right? We're not going to belabor this point today. Just going to show these 3 figures to make my points. Phylogeny, demographic histories, and distributions, and chromosome synteny. I'm showing just part A, the phylogeny. So here we have a bunch of different deer. All right, great. Here's all of our deer on the one side. Those are representatives from the family, right? We just said there's more than 50 different species, but this represents the major groups or the major genera. And so we'll see that you've got, one of them has a diploid number of 70 chromosomes. So they have 2 copies there, like you have 46 chromosomes, 2n equals 46. You have 2 copies of your genome. So you have 23 chromosomes, but you have 2 copies of each, right? So you have 46. So these animals right here, actually that is the reindeer, has 70 chromosomes total. And then you've got another genus. I don't remember exactly what the common name of this little critter right here is, but it has 70 chromosomes as well. And then you've got another genus that only has 66 chromosomes, another genus that has 68 chromosomes. And then look down here, we've got the muntjac, all right, genus. And one member of that genus has 46 chromosomes, right? So a lot fewer chromosomes than the other members. But then this is really crazy. We get down here to another species that only has 6 chromosomes. Right? 6 chromosomes, 8 chromosomes, and 8 chromosomes. Now, on the face of it, if you don't know anything about the sizes of those chromosomes, you might think of like only 6 chromosomes and another species has 46 chromosomes. How could that possibly, how could those organisms even look similar to one another? Well, they've reorganized their chromosomes. They actually probably have similar numbers of genes. The difference is those chromosomes are huge in the one species that only has 6 chromosomes. And in other species that have 70 chromosomes, they're much smaller chromosomes. So it's a repackaging of the genome information. Now, remember, young Earth creationists believe that all of these are actually related by a common ancestor. Right? All of these are related to some animals that were on Noah's Ark. And there was only 2 of them. 2 individuals. One individual, maybe they had different chromosome numbers, but if they had different chromosomes, they still have to end up with all these different kinds of chromosome numbers at the end. And so how did that come to be? Here is their analysis, right? Suggesting, well, for one thing, they're suggesting they were more than 10 million years old. So young Earth creationist and evolutionary biologist both agree that all of these different deer share a common ancestor in the past. At one time, there weren't all these different species. There was just one species. Now, creationists say there was only 2 individuals. I don't think any evolutionary biologists would say it was just 2 individuals at one point that represent the entire, that are the entire species. Nonetheless, there is just a single species, a single type, a single morphology. And then out of that comes all this different variation, including all these different rearrangements of the chromosomes. Now, what they're showing here is there's different kinds of, now how would you get from one chromosome number, which they're thinking is something like 68. How would you go from like 68 chromosomes to 6? Well, in order to do that, you're going to have to fuse chromosomes together. And that's what they've identified. They've identified all these different arrows represent either Robertsonian fusions or tandem fusions. There's also been some fissions. All right, fissions are like you take one chromosome and you break it into 2. So now you have 2 chromosomes where you used to have just 1. Now, I got to say something about Robertsonian fusions. These are rather difficult fusions. This is where you have, I should have had a picture of this. Here's a chromosome. And, well, actually, here's an acentric chromosome, meaning you have the centromere, which sounds like center point, but it's not always right in the center, all right? So This one is acrocentric. So you have a little tiny short arm, and you have what's called the long arm chromosome. And then you have another chromosome, and it has a long arm, and it has a little short arm. And what can happen in a Robertsonian fusion is that you can end up fusing the long arm here to this centromere, and they have this long arm, and you lose the little two short ends, all right? Or the two short, well, actually what happens is the two short ends also fuse together, and you end up, my picture drawing is crazy here, but you end up with a little tiny chromosome with two little short arms. Typically what happens is that the short arm chromosome is lost somehow. Unless it contains some really important genes, all right, then it can't be lost. Natural selection is going to maintain it. But often the little short arms are lost. And what you end up with is a very large chromosome as a result, with the two long arms connected to one another. Now, why do I bring that up? Because Robertsonian fusions, typically those are mutations that don't yield any positive result, for an organism. There are many Robertsonian fusions that occur in human beings, and almost every single one of them would be considered a genetic mutation that causes individuals to either be unfertile or not be able to live until they're at reproductive age. And therefore, that particular fused chromosome isn't going to get passed to the next generation very easily. And so the point here is that in any natural population of other organisms, like deer, if there's a Robertsonian fusion, the chances that that's going to be a viable organism are pretty slim. Now, when I say chances, there is a small chance that it will work. And it apparently does work because it has happened in history. And both young earth creationists and evolutionary biologists are going to agree to this, because young earth creationists pretty much are going to have to propose, once they look at these chromosomes, that there have been Robertsonian fusions that have occurred that have created these very small chromosome total numbers. The chromosomes are huge, but there's not very many of them because of these Robertsonian fusions that have occurred. Now, there's not a lot of them. Here's one right here. I'm sorry, that's a tandem. This is Robertsonian fusion right here. Here's one right here. And here's another one over here. In fact, they're proposing three different ones at this point. All right, and down here they have the chromosome numbers. 11 plus 6, 5 plus 27, 34, plus the X chromosome. Really weird thing going on with the sex chromosomes. Even they're fused to other chromosomes. So really bizarre stuff going on in the barking deer. Tandem fusions are a little simpler. That's just one chromosome fusing to the end of another chromosome, right? And we do have that as well in human beings. That happens to some individuals. But remember, even if it happens to individuals, it has to eventually become part of every single member of the species. And that takes a long time. It takes a lot of generations to pass those chromosomes on and for them to infiltrate and become selected to become representative of the entire species. So we have massive differences in chromosome numbers and relatively consistent chromosomes within the species, even though there's hundreds of thousands of those individuals. And so young earth creationists have a limited amount of time to explain all this genetic variation, right? You've only got 4,000 years. How many generations is that? Right? Maybe 10,000 generations. And you have to have had all these changes, and then you have to have these populations having had to have grown, and they have to have, they have to have preserved all this different variation within a large number of individuals. All right, if there's hundreds of thousands of reindeer and they all have 70 chromosomes, they can all be traced back to a common ancestor that had 70 chromosomes. So therefore, you're pushing back to these events, these fusion events and fission events. All right, so when did all this happen? Over some brief period of time? But the likelihood of any one of these fusion or fission events being successful is very minute. So what you have to have an opportunity for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of fusions and fissions occur in individuals, such that a couple individuals have a fusion or fission that just so happens to be the right combination such that it doesn't kill the animal and it's able to pass it on. And then after it passes it on to the next generation, you're still going to have individuals that have a weird mix of, I've got, individuals that have odd numbers of chromosomes, and I have individuals that have a weird, wacky, like 3 copies of one chromosome and only 1 copy of another one, right? These are all going to be things that don't really work very well. And so you're going to have extraordinary circumstances to allow for these accidents to get fixed into populations and become representative of the entire species. We only have 4,000 years. You don't have a lot of time for that to happen. And so young Earth creationists have to speculate that some kind of process that we don't fully understand today was occurring in the past. For evolutionary biology, we're talking about 10 million years. So we're talking about 100 million generations of deer populations reproducing. That's a lot of opportunities for weird things to happen. All right. Now, let me show you again that let me give you another figure that gives you a simple let's look at a simplified version of this figure, but it also adds in something else, which is a little map of the chromosomes. And this will just hopefully blow you away in terms of the amount of changes that have occurred within the deer. So here we are. Here's our deer. And now we're just looking at 4 different members of the deer family. We're looking at, this is the reindeer, and these are the barking deer. And I can't remember what C. elephas is. And up here we have cows. So we're just comparing to cow because the entire cow genome is known, and the cow genome is not that different. In fact, the cow family is considered sort of a sister family to the cervid family. So they're suggesting that, there requires a fusion, 6 fusions here, another 6 fusions, and 26 fusions in order to get down to the just 6 chromosomes that are left, right? To go from 70 down to 6, you're going to have a lot of fused chromosomes. So here's the chromosome map. So here's all your chromosome numbers across. And then here is the 2n equals 46. There's the muntjac species. Remember, this species and this species are both muntjac species, right? So they're in the same genus. That means they look very similar to one another. Yet one of them has 46 chromosomes, the other one has 6. And so let's look at the one that has 46. The one that has 46 this is a fairly large chromosome here, number 2. Number 2 looks like it's the combination of all these chromosomes put together. So that's multiple fusion events. Not all probably at the same time, right? It's probably 2 chromosomes got fused together, then another one got fused to that one, another one got fused to that one. Again, every one of those events, it wouldn't be like deer is born with a fusion, and then it has a fusion in its own sperm or egg, gives it to the next generation, then it has a fusion. In other words, this isn't a 2-generation, 3-generation thing. This is a fusion, which then requires probably a long time of passing that fusion down, getting into a lot of individuals, so you can have separate individuals mate with each other, so they both have that fusion, so they represent a stable genome once again. Because when you just have a fusion in somebody else, and you mate with something that doesn't have the fusion, you're going to end up with odd numbers of chromosomes. Right? And most of the times, those genetic combinations aren't going to work out, just like in human beings with fusion. It typically doesn't work out very well. Right? You end up with not being able to have kids. Only once in a while do you stumble upon some weird pattern of chromosomes and mismatches of chromosomes, and yet it still all works out biologically. And so maybe this is several thousand generations of passing this fused genome down, and it begins to become more common in the population. And now you have individuals in the population mating with each other that have the fused chromosome, and therefore they're easily passing it on, right? Because now they're diploids. They both had the fused copy. Everything's nice and settled, right? I feel like these are the normal versions of the deer at that point, of that species. And then one of those individuals has a fusion event, because they're rare. One individual has a fusion, and the whole process has to start over again, where it passes it to the next generation, and maybe one individual of its offspring has that, and then maybe it passes on to another one, and maybe they can mate and have offspring that have both copies have that new fusion event, right? It's going to take multiple generations in order to sort these changes in chromosome numbers out to form a consistent pattern. Because as I said before, you look at cows, they have a consistent number of 60 chromosomes. You're going to find a few weird exceptions in a few individual cows on Earth, right? But in order to change the chromosome number of cows from 60 to 62, that's going to take thousands of generations. in order for that change to then sweep across and now become all of the members of that population, except for, again, a few rare individuals that will have another fusion event or fission event. All right, so now we've shown that 2 is the combination of 23. And when I say combination, they have the whole genome. They have all the genes on chromosome number 25 from this organism. And they can see that all those genes are present in chromosome number 2, and they're right next to all the chromosomes from number 15 and number 10 and number 4, and they're just all stacked up against each other. And in some cases, they can see that the telomere ends, the ends of the chromosomes, there are little patches of chromosome ends that are inside of chromosome number 2 because that's how they fuse together. And that's been maintained over time. So that's one of the evidences, that additional evidence that these are fused chromosomes, is you see the caps of the chromosomes still present in these chromosomes. All right, so this has 46 chromosomes. So yes, chromosome number 1 seems to be a combination of several chromosomes. Chromosome X is still chromosome X, but chromosome, what is it? There's a few other fusions here, right? Not very many, but you had to have some to get from 68 down to 46, or from 70 down to 46. But now let's look at the other species. Remember, this is a very similar species. Here's chromosome number 2. Chromosome number 2 is the combination of fusing all of these chromosomes together into a single chromosome. And again, this, from a molecular genetic standpoint, would be extraordinarily difficult to understand. I can't really conceive of how all those chromosomes could be attached together at one time in one accident, forming chromosome number 2. And even so, you'd have one copy in that individual, and they'd have like one copy of chromosome number 2, and they'd have all the other copies of chromosome from the other parent, because, these mistakes are only made, not in both chromosomes, but in one chromosome, one set of chromosomes in the sperm or the egg. That's where this occurs. And you just create a wild and crazy scenario. It's already wild and crazy, right? That would be even crazier. What's more likely is you have the combination of 2 chromosomes, and eventually you have a combination of another one. Again, you have many generations. So if you go back to the common ancestor, at some point in the past, now they're estimating based on the molecular clock, this was 5 million years ago. Remember, for creationists, this can at max be 4,300 years ago. So 4,300 years ago, there was just a couple, 2 individuals, right? Or 5 million years ago, there was a population that all had 58 chromosomes. And that population, some individuals had a fusion. And those individuals eventually broke off into a new population that then created this new species. And eventually those fusions accumulated, and today, presently, there's 46 chromosomes in all the members of that particular species. But other individuals in that population had fusions, but they had different fusions, right? And they had a lot more of them. So this population, maybe the population got separated on different continents. Some wandered off someplace and they started a new population. Individual in that population had this fusion event, a single fusion event. Eventually that made them different from their cousins, because now that's what they are, as cousins. And this population had 26 different fusions. Went from 58 all the way down to just 6 chromosomes. And they're only showing a couple of them here on this map. Here's chromosome number 1, number 2, and 3, which is also combined with the X chromosome, right? The sex chromosomes are weirdly fused to the other chromosomes. So even their sex determining system has been affected by this process. And so this is, again, it's really difficult for me to emphasize just how dramatic these changes are and how these can't just happen overnight. They don't just happen in a single generation. This is a process of genetic sorting, natural selection, happenstance, and accidents that are only going to occur once every thousands of generations. These mutations are happening every generation, just like in human beings. There are people on this earth today that have a number of different fusion events and have odd numbers of chromosomes. But it's highly unlikely that even 1,000 years from now, that all of us are going to have another chromosome, or we're going to have 40, we're going to have 50 chromosomes instead of 48, right? The length of time it's going to take for some individuals, even if they have a chromosome fusion that doesn't kill them and allows them to still continue to reproduce, they're going to have family members of it. They're going to have offspring. Those offspring may have that particular fusion of that chromosome. And eventually they're going to create a number of individuals that may mate with each other. And eventually they're going to have individuals that will have like a completely different chromosome number, right? So they went from 49 and eventually to 50 chromosomes, right? You can do the calculations. How long is it going to take for everybody to have that? Even if it has an advantage, even if there's like some advantage to having that fusion. Sorry, I've been talking fusions and adding chromosomes. I should have been saying fission, breaking chromosomes apart. Well, how long will it take for us to go from 48 chromosomes back down to 46 chromosomes? A whole long time. I just realized I've been making another mistake as I've been talking. I've been talking about 48 chromosomes. I slipped. We have 46 chromosomes. All right. So how long will it take for us to go from 46 chromosomes to 44? A long time. A lot of generations are involved in this process. All right. Just a couple more slides here. Let's go into more detail on these chromosomes. So up here we have, this is Bos taurus. So that's cow. And remember, creationists believe that cows are separately created. And I showed you that first figure. And that first figure was cow compared to another deer. It wasn't this one, though. And I showed you how there was various fusion events and how the genomes were starting to mix together. And so creationists come along and say, oh, see, that's obviously genetic difference between these two. These are separately created. I could use that as genetic evidence that these are separately created kinds. Well, then, what are you going to do when you come down here and you look at this muntjac species right here, which is just as different from this other species of deer as deer are from cows, right? There's just as much change going on here as there was between cows and this deer. And then you go from this species of muntjac to this species of muntjac. And look at all this crazy amount of recombination that's occurred. And then I haven't even added in the fact that there is a female version which is different than the male version of the chromosomes. And you think, well, X and Y. Well, but the weird thing is that males have an X chromosome that's separate, and females have an X chromosome that is actually attached to another chromosome. And the Y chromosome is actually embedded into the first chromosome. But so imagine sorting that out in the original mutations that occurred, right? That's not going to be an easy thing to sort out and have biologically work. This might take hundreds of generations of sort of like probably non-optimal organisms that are surviving, but not necessarily thriving. And eventually natural selection shapes that genome into a workable situation, which is very different than its close relative. So the difference between this genome, right, and this genome is immense, right? It's as big as the differences between human beings and chimpanzees, if not more difference than that. And so the point is that to all of this is that Ken Ham and other young earth creationists, they're quick to say that, oh, this is just variation within a kind. God created a lot of variation in the original kind, and then he allowed that variation to be sort of dispersed into a bunch of different species. Now, what he and other creationists are often talking about is they're thinking about like the overall like alleles, the variants of genes, right? There's a whole bunch of different variants of genes in the original ancestor. There actually can't be that many in the original ancestor, but let's just grant them that there was a lot of variation in the original ancestor. And then that got sorted out, kind of like Ken Ham's example of like you got a wolf and it has variation. You sort it out into different packages of genetic variation and you have domesticated dogs. Great. Domesticated dogs have the same number of chromosomes as wolves, right? You're right. They just had each package has less variation than the original whole. But in the case of these deer, each one of these deer has immense amounts of genetic variation, right? And if you combine all that genetic variation and try to put that into just two individuals on the ark, That's an unreasonable task, right? It's impossible. Now I can use the word impossible. Let's say it's so unlikely that it's not a rational or reasonable thing to think is the answer to this question. That we could package all this variation into just 4,000 years and into just 2 individuals. But I'm upping the ante one. And the ante upping is this. All of the chromosomal rearrangements have to be sorted out into different species. And that is far more complex than simply taking, oh, there's 4 different alleles for this gene, and 2 alleles end up being selected in this population versus these other 2 in this other population. These are major changes to the genomic structure that all have to occur. And for evolutionary biologists, they've got 10, 15, 20 million years of opportunities for these things to happen. Hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of generations in order to work out these genetic problems. Young Earth creationists have 4,000 years, and they don't even really have that because some of these populations of these organisms are huge. And so you probably have to have a couple thousand years just to explain how they got to the population sizes they have. And therefore, you'd have to say that they already had that number of chromosomes way back thousands of years in order for all the individuals to still have that same number of chromosomes today, right? So that's the population growth model. They have to work with that. So that compresses all of these different mutations, all these different chromosomal rearrangements into an extremely short period of time, probably in just the space of like 100 years after the flood. Completely untenable. This is I think, a tremendous challenge to young Earth creationist geneticists to be able to provide an explanation for this kind of variation. And this is why I say Ken Ham, if he thinks that all these are just one kind, that he is a young Earth evolutionist. He is accepting this is the evolutionary model, right? All these fusions, fissions, and all that, saying that this is how this must have formed all these different species. He is accepting that all these are genetically related to one another, which means he's accepting that all this genetic variation can be, could have occurred. He thinks it happened over a very short period of time, but nonetheless, he believes that evolution happened over a very short period of time. All right, yeah, just rambling again. So we better just stop this right now. Yeah, the deer, crazy chromosomes. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.